So, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest lockdown lecture with Harif. Harif, for those who don't know, the organization aims to raise awareness of the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. It's been going about 15 years. It is run by volunteers. There are just 5 of us, and we try to do the best we can with very limited resources. So this is the latest of our online lectures. It is being recorded. It is being live streamed to the Harif Facebook page, and you will be able to watch that at any time. So the title of tonight's lecture is "The British in Iraq, Were They Good for the Jews?" And the reason why I chose to give this talk today on the 2nd of June is because 79 years ago, a terrible event broke out in Iraq, and that was the Farhud against the Jews. It was 2 days of massacre. Some 179 identified Jews were murdered. There was terrible rape and looting and mutilation. 900 shops were destroyed. 1,000 people wounded. It came as a terrible shock to the Jews of Iraq, and within 10 years, 90% of the community had left. So in order to understand the history behind this terrible event, I would just go back in history and show you a PowerPoint. So the Jewish community of Iraq, it was one of the oldest diaspora communities, 2,700 years old. It goes back to the Babylonian captivity, when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar took Jewish captives as slaves to Babylon from Jerusalem. And there by the rivers of Babylon, they sat down and wept and remembered Zion. And 70 years later, the Persian king Cyrus allowed Jews to go back to Jerusalem, but many of them chose to stay on in Iraq. And there they stayed in continuous residence for 2,700 years until about 70 years ago. They had a glorious history in Iraq. There were ups and downs, but the Iraqi Jewish community, or I should say the Babylonian Jewish community, actually made a huge contribution to Judaism as we know it. And they wrote the Babylonian Talmud. They had academies, Talmudic academies in Babylon. They survived a succession of different rulers: the Persians, the Greeks, the Sassanids, the Abbasids, the Mongols, the Mamluks, the Ottomans. The British period began in the early 20th century and was actually very short, no longer than about 14 years. But the main focus of my talk today is the British role in the Farhud, the great massacre of June 1941. The Farhud is an Arabic word meaning forced dispossession. And as I mentioned, it led to the demise of the community within just 10 years. And at that point, 90% of the community of 150,000 Jews fled to Israel. A small minority, including my own parents, went to the UK. Today, there are just 5 Jews in Iraq. So this is the land of the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And the picture at the top shows you the sort of typical guffers. These were round circular boats that used to float along the river Tigris. The bottom pictures show that Baghdad was basically a city of flat roofs, and these actually would be a way of Jews saving their lives during the Farhud. The buildings were very close together, and the survivors of the Farhud jumped from roof to roof, from house to house, to get away from the rioters and the looters. And the last picture on your right shows one of the bridges across the Tigris. So here we are in 1917. The British have just fought a very tough war against the Ottoman Turks, and they finally emerged victorious. So here at the top of your screen, you see a statue of General Maude, who was the general commanding the British forces, and he entered Baghdad in 1917. And the pictures at the bottom show stamps from my husband Lawrence's collection, marked with British occupation of Iraq. Oh no, Baghdad, because it wasn't Iraq then. And there is, on the left, you see a postcard showing a British soldier standing outside the Baghdad fortress. Now, Iraq was strategically very important. It was on the route to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Now, very soon, the British appreciated the importance of Iraq's oil, and 90% of Iraq's oil actually fueled the British Navy. So you can see how important this area was to Britain. Iraq's oil was actually sent down a pipeline from Mosul to Haifa, and it was the carotid artery of the British Empire. The British Mandate was set up soon after the British entered Baghdad, and three figures were mainly responsible for setting up this mandate. And they were all connected in some way to the Arab Bureau, which was an intelligence gathering bureau based in Cairo. There was Gertrude Bell, who was known as the uncrowned Queen of Iraq. She was one of the first women to graduate from Oxford University. She was an adventurer, an archaeologist, a mountaineer. Once she was stuck in the Alps on a rope for hours. She died in 1926, aged only 57, and it's believed she took an overdose of pills. The second important figure behind the British Mandate was T.E. Lawrence, better known to us today, I think, as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was an archaeologist, he was a military strategist, a fluent Arabic speaker, and soon befriended the Hashemite tribe in Arabia during World War I. And he was the one who found Emir Faisal, the future king of Iraq, and fetched him from Morocco. So, not Morocco, sorry, Mecca. The third figure in all this was a figure you might not have heard of, called Cornwallis. Now, before we move on to Cornwallis, actually, can I just go back 1 second and point out this was Gertrude Bell, and T.E. Lawrence is the man standing to the right of the Emir Faisal in this picture here. This was taken a few years later. So Cornwallis, let's fast forward to Cornwallis. Cornwallis was probably the least known of the three figures behind the British mandate, but he was possibly the most powerful of the three. He was an advisor to Emir Faisal from 1916. Then he became an advisor to the Ministry of the Interior, which sounds very humble, actually, but he was in fact a plenipotentiary. And he was personal advisor to Emir Faisal for 14 years. He worked very closely with Gertrude Bell. Until 1935, he was British ambassador in Baghdad. He went back to London and then returned as ambassador in April 1941. That's 2 months before the Farhud broke out. In 1919, the Paris Peace Conference set the peace terms after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. In 1920, the San Remo Treaty allocated mandates to Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia. The idea was that Britain and France would govern these territories until they were ready for independence. The Kurds and Assyrians were promised autonomy, but never got it. In 1921, Iraq was established by the Cairo Conference, but there was a secret deal between Britain and France to take over the Ottoman lands, and Britain decided that Mesopotamia should be a kingdom. A British government with Arab advisors, not an Arab nation with British advisors. The British were meant to help the Iraqis achieve self-determination, but Iraq was not a nation. It was 3 Ottoman provinces or vilayets thrown together. As the British advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of the Interior, Cornwallis played a part in the ratification of the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1922. This was a very important treaty because it meant there was going to be a long-term military alliance to ensure that the British had military control of Iraq and of its oil. From 1921, Cornwallis was charged with offering Faisal the job of king. So Faisal was brought from Arabia. He was from the Hashemite dynasty in Arabia, but he'd been promised the throne of Syria, and the understanding was that he would rule a pan-Arab kingdom from Damascus. But of course, the British double-crossed Faisal, conniving with the French, and Faisal had to be dragged to Baghdad and would only come with Cornwallis. And it was said at the time Faisal was the first ruler to come from the south. When Sir Son Haskell, who was later to be finance minister, remarked to Churchill, who was then Secretary of the Colonies, that all previous rulers had come from the north, i.e. Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Churchill said to him, well, Cornwallis came from the north and he came with Faisal. So Cornwallis is this very tall gentleman on the extreme left of your picture. He was about 6'4", apparently, and towered over everybody else. So things did not start well, with Faisal in dispute with the British over the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty. He was bitterly disappointed that he didn't get the throne of Syria, And apparently he was quite intransigent and manipulative, and he actually threatened to abdicate several times during his reign. And this is the scene in 1921 at the coronation of King Faisal, surrounded by British officials. Actually, keep it there.
Go back.
Go back. So when it had been under Ottoman rule, Iraq suffered from corruption, but each community governed itself, which gave minorities a certain degree of security. But now that Iraq was considered one nation, the minorities were at the mercy of the majority. And letters written by Gertrude Bell at the time did express concern for minorities, because there had been massacres of Kurds, Armenians, and others. And the Jews were one minority that was so worried at the prospect of an independent Iraq that they appealed to Sir Percy Cox, the British High Commissioner, to be given British nationality. And this they did 3 times. The famous historian Eli Kaduri actually said about the Jews that they were defeated from the start, but they did not know it and would not know it for a long time to come. The situation was beyond their understanding. So the Jews were denied British nationality, and they just had to make do with the situation. The new Iraq ignored Kurdish aspirations as well, and they too were frustrated. The name Iraq actually referred to an area of the Basra province or Vilayet, and also Kuwait, and the British took the name to describe the whole country. So when the British mandate began, actually the unrest that had characterized the state of the region under World War I continued, and there was resistance in the south of the country, leading to British bombing, and serious uprisings by Arabs and Kurds took place in 1920 and 1921. And on orders of Churchill, these people were crushed with mustard gas. And when people complained about this, he said, "I don't understand why people are so squeamish. They are only uncivilized tribes." So the Jews, let's talk about the Jews. Baghdad was 1/3 Jewish, and they welcomed Faisal. In Baghdad, Jews honored Faisal with a reception, and here you see them at the Great Synagogue. A Torah scroll was taken out and Faisal kissed it, and he told them they were one race with the Arabs, and there would be no discrimination between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And he also said Jews are the moving spirit of Iraq. And Jews always talk about Faisal with great affection. They thought of him as a very fair and just and wise leader. Gertrude Bell was actually quite excited by the presence of the Jews in Baghdad. She had great hopes for them. And in a letter to her parents, which she wrote in 1917, she said, "I'm now going to cultivate the Jew community. There are 80,000 in Baghdad out of a population of 200,000, and find out more about them. So far, I've only met the bigwigs, such as the chief rabbi. There's no doubt they will be a great power here someday." So Gertrude Bell busied herself at first to look for a palace fit for King Faisal. And move on. she found this place here, which is called Qasr Shashua, Shashua Palace, which belonged to the Shashua family, a Jewish family. And Faisal rented this house from the Shashua family for 2 years until a palace could be built for him. Now, the British faced the great task of reconstructing the country after the damage inflicted by World War I. There were great challenges in terms of public hygiene. There were rats everywhere, there was cholera, and the British needed to build public buildings, irrigation systems, roads, bridges, and railways, and establish telegraphic communications. And there was a great deal of work to be done in the education, justice, and police fields as well. And in all this, the British found a very willing partner in the Jewish community. Now, the Jewish community, which was actually the single largest ethnic group in Baghdad and comprised about 1/3 of the city, had already become an educated community thanks to the establishment of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a network of schools established in the late 19th century. And what the Alliance Israélite school network did was introduce the Jews to Western education, and it gave them the skills and talents to thrive under the British mandate. And so, of course, they came to dominate commerce, trade, the civil service. They ran the postal service, the transport service, the railways. And so began a golden age for the Jews. So Sasson Heskel, who's the figure you see on the screen here in his full regalia, was the Jewish finance minister throughout the 1920s. And he still today is regarded as one of the most successful ministers that Iraq has ever had. And his crowning achievement really was to tie Iraq's oil revenues to the gold standard. Next. Okay. Jews were very prominent in trade. And here you can see my two grandfathers with their handlebar moustaches standing there at the back. The British Chamber of Commerce, sorry, not the British, the Iraqi Chamber of Commerce had 18 members. Here's a picture taken in 1938, had 18 members, and of those 18, 10 were Jews. Now, what was, and Jews, of course, were very prominent in culture, in literature, in music. And this is a picture of the Al-Kuwaiti brothers. And most of the musicians, in fact, in Iraq were Jews. What was the attitude of the British to Zionism? Well, Gertrude Bell was angered by talk of an empty Palestine. She could see Arabs and Jews could not live peacefully side by side. And she is quoted as having said, Zionism is a stupendous barrier to honest dealing with the Arabs. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, was more sympathetic. He came from a family of Christian Zionists. There were fledgling Zionist groups and periodicals, but these did not last. But Iraqi Jews did buy plots of land in Eretz Israel and there was general sympathy with the Zionist movement. However, hostility to Zionism was rising among the Arabs. In 1928, there was a visit by the British politician and prominent Zionist Sir Alfred Mond. 40,000 protesters turned out to demonstrate against him, and there were riots. Jewish shops and businesses were damaged and looted. What was the British role in this? My late father always believed that it was orchestrated, that the protests were orchestrated by the British to divide and rule. The mob was chanting "Down with Zionism," but in fact they didn't know what Zionism was, Zionia, and they were chanting "Down with Paswania," which was the security tax. And even if the British didn't actually orchestrate the riots, they didn't really do much to control them. Right. So, okay, so 1930, Iraq enters the League of Nations. The British take a back seat as Iraq declares its independence in 1932, but Iraq is still in the British sphere of influence. The following year, Faisal dies, and his son Ghazi succeeds him. That's King Ghazi, you see here. Now, Ghazi was a playboy who liked fast cars, and you see one of them here. And he surrounded himself with pro-Nazis. He died 6 years later in a car crash. And I learned yesterday from Joe Samuels, who was giving a talk for Jemena, that there was a time, at the time, a conspiracy theory that the British actually killed him off, but I don't know if there's much truth to that. It was actually a car crash. Now, T.E. Lawrence had a sense of foreboding that the new state of Iraq would not last much longer, or would not ever achieve any kind of democracy, and in fact would end up being a failed state. He wrote to Gertrude Bell's father after her death in 1926, "The Iraq state is a fine monument, even if it lasts a few years, as I often fear and sometimes hope." In 1933, there was a massacre of Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians were used by the British as a police force, and 600 Assyrians were actually killed in Simele in the north of Iraq. Cornwallis was also rather disappointed in the way things were turning out, and he said, "Let them fight each other until a strong man emerges." So at this time, there was the rise of pro-Nazi feeling, and in the previous slide, you can see young Iraqis actually making the Nazi fascist salute here. This was taken in 1932. Iraqi nationalism actually was particularly strong during the 1930s. There was a club called the Muthana Club, which turned out to be a hotbed of anti-Semitic nationalism. Paramilitary youth groups like the Futuah were set up, and then pro-Nazi anti-Semitic publications started to circulate. For instance, Mein Kampf was serialized, translated into Arabic and serialized in Arabic newspapers. And there was also Nazi propaganda. In 1939, hundreds of Syrians and Palestinians arrived in Iraq, and one of them was the Mufti of Jerusalem, who'd been exiled to Baghdad after the failure of the Arab revolt. He was exiled by the British. And he was practically is one of the driving forces behind the incitement that led to the Farhud. In the 2 years that he lived in Baghdad, the Mufti never ceased to incite against the Jews of Iraq. He never ceased to try and overthrow the pro-British government at the time. And eventually he and a nationalist leader called Rashid Ali al-Ghalani finally succeeded in overthrowing the pro-British government in conjunction with a group of pro-Nazi officers. Now, the first thing that the pro-Nazi government did was to declare an alliance with Nazi Germany. And on the 2nd of May, Rashid Ali declared war on the British. The pro-British regent, Abdul Ilah, fled from Baghdad to Jordan. Now, the pro-Nazi government actually was in power for barely 2 months, but it was a terrible time for the Jews who locked themselves in their houses. Jews were accused of being collaborators with the British and accused of sending secret signals to the British. There were Jews killed in the street, and the populace was sort of galvanized by Nazi propaganda to become hostile to the Jews. Now, when Rashid Ali declared war on the British decided to send troops to secure the Mosul-Haifa pipeline, but Hitler needed Iraqi oil for his Soviet invasion that he was planning. Rashid Ali ordered the Iraqi army to surround the RAF base at Habbaniyah, which is to the west of Baghdad, 50 miles west of Baghdad. And in what's been called the Second Battle of Britain, the RAF, using very old aircraft, defeated 1,000 Iraqis with modern aircraft and equipment. At the time, the Nazis were winning the war. This was 1941. Rommel was making great advances in North Africa. General Wavell, who was the British commander-in-chief in Cairo, was at odds with Churchill about what they should do about Rashid Ali in Iraq. Wavell was fully stretched. He and Cornwallis wanted to negotiate with Rashid Ali, but Churchill wanted to fight. On the ground, Churchill ordered a column of British troops that would be called Hab Force to relieve the RAF base at Habbaniyah. And these were sent over from Palestine. Churchill said to Wavell on the 9th of May, having joined Habbaniyah forces, you should exploit the situation to the utmost, not hesitating to try to break into Baghdad, even with quite small forces. The British at the time were so desperate for help that they called in the Irgun to destroy oil refineries and pipelines in Iraq. And David Raziel agreed on condition that he could kidnap the Grand Mufti and take him back to Palestine. But his orders were changed to gather intelligence. Raziel was killed, in fact, by a German bomber before he could really do anything much. Meanwhile, Anglo-Indian troops were approaching Iraq from the south through Basra, which is at the bottom of the map there. On the 8th of May, Basra was sacked by the Anglo-Indian troops, Rioting breaks out in Basra on the 8th of May, but the British were under orders not to intervene. And these orders came from Wavell. Britain did not intend to occupy the country. And what happened in Basra was actually a portent of things to come. But on the 24th of May, Wavell seems to have made an about turn, and he gave orders to occupy Baghdad at the earliest date. On the 30th of May, the main force arrived 3 miles west of Baghdad and stopped. But Wavell's orders had been changed. It seems that Cornwallis countermanded Wavell's 24th of May order. Troops would not be sent to control the bridges of Baghdad. In fact, Cornwallis ordered the northern column of Hab force, known as King Cole, to turn back to Habbaniyah. On the 29th of May, the government of Rashid Ali collapsed, and he and his supporters fled to Persia. On the morning of the 31st of May, the mayor of Baghdad and a delegation approached British forces at the Wash Ash Bridge outside of Baghdad. With the mayor, Al-Umari, was Sir Kinahan Cornwallis. Terms were quickly reached, an armistice was signed, and the monarchy and a pro-British government were put back in place. And on the 1st of June, the regent was on his way back to Baghdad. That morning, a delegation of Jews wearing their Shavuot best suits ventured out of their homes for the first time in a month to greet the regent at the bridge. On the 1st of June, an armed Iraqi mob began a 2-day murder spree against Baghdad's Jews, known as the Farhud. About 6 weeks after the Farhud, the Jewish Agency filed this report. Eyewitness reports, fearful picture of anti-Jewish excesses at Baghdad, June the 1st, June the 2nd, being days of Jewish Pentecost festival. Massacre began upon return of Jewish delegation from Regent. Jews removed from cars and brutally murdered. Then mob began attack on Jewish holiday crowds walking in the street. Fearful details received of ghastly tortures and murders concurred. Dead bodies defiled, children thrown into Euphrates, he meant Tigris, wounded, poisoned in hospital. Estimates, 500 Jews killed and over 1,000 wounded. Thousands homeless in streets and synagogues. Armed police, ultimately students, secondary schools and colleges participated. Killing and robbing continued for 2 days after establishment of new regime, only stopped when British troops took action. Rabbi compelled to sign statement, only 70 killed. No investigation, no punishment. Cornwallis was later to describe this report as highly coloured, but he admitted it was substantially true. It was only when the rioters and looters started threatening the Muslim districts in Baghdad, the mayor of Baghdad and police loyal to the Iraqi monarchy quelled the violence by imposing a curfew and shot violators on sight. What was the role of the British Embassy in all this? Did they know what was going on? And most of all, why was the order not given to quell the violence beforehand? Even senior aides in the embassy had become disturbed. The embassy was situated on the left bank of the Tigris. Just get up the map to show you. So,
Have you got the map? It's on there.
Yeah, there it is. Right. So the British Embassy, as you can see, was on the left side of the River Tigris, and the Farhud was raging in the old city, in the old Jewish quarter, on the right hand side. So the people in the British Embassy could actually hear what was going on. They could hear the screams and the gunshots coming from across the river. Senior aides in the embassy, we know, had become disturbed. A man called Vivian Holt made impassioned pleas to Cornwallis, but Cornwallis was closeted with the generals. There was a Jew in the embassy who'd even been given a gun by the embassy, so alarmed were they. Now, Freya Stark, who was a writer, was actually in the embassy herself. Can you go on one? Yeah, that's great. She was in the embassy, and she writes, "It was a night of snapping rifles, police posts doubled, Jews murdered, reports vary between 12 and 500. Abdallah Ezra, that's a Jew who happened to be in the embassy, says he was wading in blood up Ghazi Street. The shooting is getting momently stronger." And another visitor to the embassy, Somerset de Chair, who's actually stationed with Habforce, he visited the embassy shortly after the Farhud, and he wrote, "The library contained an air conditioning unit. It is impossible to keep a cool head without it," Sir Kinahan Cornwallis said. He told me that 2,000 people, mostly Jews, were believed to have been killed in the one night's looting, a figure which was subsequently reduced to 700. To conclude, were the British in Iraq good for the Jews? The answer, I think, is that the British did enable the Jews to experience their golden age, an age of great hope, prosperity, and flourishing culture. But at the end of the day, the British were prepared to betray the Jews by failing to intervene and stop the killing. The British wanted to maintain the fiction that they were not fighting the Iraqi army. They did not want to give the impression that they were occupying the country or that they had put the regent in power. And this is not the first instance of a colonial power refusing to protect Jews. It happened in Palestine during the riots in 1920-21, when the rioters chanted, "The government is with us," as they killed Jews. And also in Hebron in 1929, when there was one lone policeman, British policeman, who of course failed to protect the Jews. It happened in 1945 in Libya, which was then under British administration, and British troops in Tripoli were ordered to barracks while 3 days of looting and killing went on, and 130 Jews died then. It happened in 1947 in Aden, when, which was also under British administration at the time, and 87 Jews were murdered. The French were not much better. They did not quell anti-Jewish riots in Algeria and Morocco. And I think basically that the colonial powers were happy to exploit the Jews for what they could get out of them, but they were not indispensable to the colonial powers, and they were certainly never treated as equals. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take questions. All you have to do is type in your question in the chat. There's a little button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to read them out and answer them.
Right. first question is, do we know whether the Arab Muslims were Sunni or Shia?
Right. Well, the Arab rioters were a motley collection. They were a mixture of soldiers from the Iraqi army, which could have been either Shia or Sunnis. I would think that the lower ranks were Shia and the officers were probably Sunni. Then there were Bedouins who also joined the rioters and the looters. They were mainly the looters. They joined the rioters. So the Bedouins would have been Sunni, I think. So I think the answer to your question is really probably a mixture.
Does anyone have any more questions or any stories they want to share with us? Because I've got no more questions come in.
Wait a minute. Here's one from Robin. Can you see? I can't actually read it.
Do you believe the British or indeed other colonial powers were intrinsically anti-Jewish, or was this more than the effort worth to protect any minorities?
Sorry, did you hear that? The question from Robin was, do I believe that the British were intrinsically anti-Semitic? Is that right? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think they were anti-Semitic. As I said, I think they were very happy to exploit the Jews as long as it served their purposes. They used the Jews to run the country, but at the end of the day, they were not prepared to protect them. In other words, politics came before anything else.
Hi, Ritz, I think you want to share some of your parents' reflections of the writing. Are you on the line?
Who is?
Ritz. Hello?
Yes.
Hello, Ritz.
My name is Rita, and my parents. My name is Rita. We lived right on the bank of the Tigris. At the end of our street was the British Embassy, and I did see on the destruction when the revolution came in, and the robbing of the embassy, and people cut telephones and put them in their dishdasha. This is the big shirt, long shirt that the kids wear, and they put it inside that, and they were running with it. But at any rate, my dad stayed on the Farhud with the aid of some people that he hired, some gunmen on the top of the roof. And the whole community there, the Jewish community, was at least like about 6 or 8 families, I want to say, stayed there.
Right, they stayed on the roof, and that's how they saved their lives. But they were protected, you say.
More information to you. Next door to us is Abdullah Shawaf.
Yeah.
And he was assigned by the British as, I cannot even translate the position. However, what I want to give the information is his wife, or his brother-in-law, Rashid Ali, was, is the brother of his wife. Rashid Ali was the brother of his wife. And that's how my dad got the information that we are going to get attacked, and he hired people on the top of the roof to defend.
That's very interesting what you're saying, which actually confirms the idea that the Farhud was premeditated. It wasn't just a spontaneous reaction. It is well known that that the Futuha, the paramilitary youth group, went around daubing handprints on Jewish houses the night before the Farhud. And what you're saying is that your family was privy to advance warning because of the connection with Rashid Ali, and therefore your father was able to protect himself, which was great. That just goes to show maybe Rashid Ali's sister did not want to see a bloodbath. I don't know. Why would she give your family the information? Do you think she actually was sympathetic and wanted you to protect yourselves? Hello? She's gone.
I know.
Oh.
Yeah? Do you know? Do you know why?
That's not true, because I have met the wife, and it was not told that it was going to be against the Jews.
Right.
Then the information came that something is going to come in and attack on this side of the river,
Right.
where the embassy is. Okay, it did not give information about the Jews. So
Right.
Abdullah Shawaf and his family all left.
Right.
We stayed.
Mhm.
So it was not clear that it was against the Jews. But I
Okay.
know that we had some people that came in and crossed the river.
Mhm.
They got violated by the mob,
Mhm.
and they crossed the river with their family, which he has a gentleman with his wife and daughter. And
Oh.
they sought refuge in our house, which, I mean, the house was protected all the way half the street down.
Right. Well, that is absolutely fascinating. Have you actually recorded your story with Sephardi voices, or it's worth having recording it for posterity? Hello. Somebody else. Oh, she's gone.
Lynn,
Okay.
can I ask you a question? Can you tell the story your mother tells about the cook?
Okay. So that was my husband asking me to tell the story of my mother's story. Actually, my mother was a teenager. She lived in Bataween, which was not directly affected by the Farhud, but they could hear the gunshots, they could hear the screams, and in fact, they took fright and took refuge in a neighboring house, because my mother was one of 4 girls. And of course, her father was dead worried in case they ended up being raped. So they moved to another house. While they were there, they heard a loud banging on the door. They opened the door, and there was this ashen-faced, trembling man asking to be let in. And he was, in fact, the Jewish cook of my mother's aunt. And he'd been on a bus by the river, and the rioters were pulling the Jews off the bus, shouting, "Who's a Jew? Who's a Jew?" And he said, "No, I'm not a Jew, I'm a Christian." And he ran as fast as his legs could carry him to my mother's house, and that was her story.
Mark wants to share something.
Yeah, Mark wants to share a story with us.
Not a story, just a question. Realizing that the Arab population in the Mandate, whether it was Sunni or Shia, that their aspirations for independence or an independent kingdom had been frustrated. And the Jewish population, because of their educational attainments and contacts throughout the world, being so closely aligned with the British mandatory regime, why would the Jewish population not expect to be treated with suspicion by the majority population?
I don't see why they should have been treated with suspicion from, in the normal course of events. Yeah, I think basically this was the effect of ultra-nationalism in Iraq, which actually did stigmatize the Jews as traitors, as collaborators with the British. And of course, they supported the Germans in order to get rid of the British. And I think that was the root of it. I don't think the local population, and certainly the run-of-the-mill, the Shiite population that had always been kind of under the thumb of the Sunni elite, whether Turkish or Arab, I don't think they were naturally hostile to the Jews, not at all. I think all this happened as a result of incitement by the nationalists. I think, rising incitement, and of course things were not helped by the propaganda that was spread in Iraq, either through the newspapers or through the radio, and of course, illiterate and uneducated masses were easily swayed by this propaganda. So, I don't think they were naturally predisposed against the Jews at all. I think, it was all incitement. Yeah?
Right.
Does that answer your question?
David Catan wants
Yeah.
to say something about his film.
Yeah, okay.
Okay,
David, can I unmute you? Right.
He's not unmuting himself.
Can you
David,
unmute
David,
yourself?
you have to unmute yourself if you want to talk.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Hi, David.
Thank you, Lynn. That was as informative as always. It's always great listening to your lectures.
Thank you.
Just a quick thank you. Just a quick plug for my film, which I'll be completing this year. It's a feature-length documentary on the Jews of Iraq. It includes interviews with Mayor Basri, the last head of the community, with Professor Shmuel Moreh, Eli Amir, and those who we were discussing the Farhud, that lived through the Farhud. So it's what I believe will be one of the most important films ever made on the Jews of Iraq, and it's told by those who lived it, some who lived through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all the way through to the end of the community, which was in the 70s. So watch this space, and you can visit my website, babylonfilms.co.il, and of course, Lynn will be letting people know once.
Yeah,
Ooh.
well, once it's out. Well, David, I hope that Harif will be the first to show this film when you've finished it. We would very much like to do the premiere for you, certainly in England.
Right now, Janet Dalal wants to share something about Bataween, how it was protected.
Okay, Janet Dalal, you want to share something about?
Yes, hi everybody. I wanted to
Hi,
say
Janet.
that Naji Chachak, he was a young Jewish police officer. In the Parmud time, he secured the Bataween place, and he was riding on a horse with the warwar. He was armed and he was shooting in the sky, like in the air, to make the rioters go away. So
Okay,
because my family was in Bataween, and that's how they were secured.
Fantastic. So he protected, he protected my mother effectively and her family.
Yes, ask your mom about the name, Naji Chachak.
I'll ask
And
her.
he served the community as the secretary of the community till he died.
Right, that's really interesting. I'll ask her about that.
Right.
Yeah, and Claire Wolford
So,
has a question.
Yes,
Yeah.
Claire is asking, was anyone held accountable for the Farhud?
Right, now that's a very interesting question. Maybe Janet, you can help me with this. As far as I know, I don't think anyone was held responsible. I may be wrong here. There was a commission of inquiry, but I think it only reported its findings about 10 years afterwards. Compensation was given to for Jewish property damaged in the riot, but I think it wasn't nearly enough. It was a paltry sum. The other question is, what happened to the Jews straight after the Farhud? Well, I can tell you that my own mother, her father applied for passports the day after the Farhud. It gave them such a shock, and within a few days they were off to India. They'd got where they spent. They went to Persia and then India, where they spent the rest of the war. And quite a few families, those who could, did escape. But of course, that was just a temporary absence. A lot of them did come back at the end of the war. In fact, it was quite a prosperous time for a lot of Jews, because they were kind of considered, Iraq was considered neutral after the Farhud, and therefore, it was quite a prosperous time for them. But when things began to deteriorate again at the end of the decade, with the establishment of Israel and a period of persecution in Iraq, I think at the back of people's minds, every Jew was dreading a second Farhud. And this was a primary reason why so many Jews decided to take the opportunity to leave in 1950 and emigrate from Iraq.
I was born.
Yes,
I
go ahead.
was born in 1957.
Right, yes.
And
you wouldn't. No, I've got an answer to the question actually about was anyone charged, and Rita, thank you, Rita. She says no one was charged, and the Jews continued to live with very few that left. So I don't quite know what you mean, but yes, so no one was charged, and justice really wasn't done after the Farhud.
Okay, Edward Beckor wants to speak.
Yeah, Ted Beckor, where are you?
Yes, my dear. How are you?
Hi.
I'm so
Very
proud of
well.
all the work you're doing. Hello,
Thank
Lawrence.
you.
It's nice to see you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, I have a story my mother used to tell. I was born June the 12th. So
Wow.
June the 1st and 2nd, she was had to seek shelter
Right.
at neighbors. And I'm not sure I'm getting this straight, but there was one Christian general in the Iraqi army.
Right.
And actually, his widow lives in Montreal, and I can't, for the life of me, remember her name, but she tells the story as well. And so I am about to be born, June the 12th, and my mother had to seek shelter at this lady's house. And he had provided bodyguards on the roof as well for his wife and whoever she was sheltering anyway.
Mhm.
So eventually I'll remember her name and I'll email you. You may even know her.
Interesting. I mean,
Interesting. It's so nice to see everyone. This Zoom thing is wonderful.
Yeah, it is wonderful. I know.
Except your cousins in Montreal are struggling. Lizette's the only one who can't get into the meeting.
Apparently, Lisette can't get into the meeting. But, yeah, go on.
I just remember the name, Leila Hindu.
Oh,
Does that ring a bell with anyone?
Please do
She
write.
was much younger than my mother, and
Yeah, I don't know a lot. I don't know if my mother would remember her or anything. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, but that's a lovely story. Thank you. And actually, let me just quickly tell my father's side of the story. Well, my father wasn't actually in Baghdad at the time, but his parents were. And they, when the riot started, they escaped through the back door of their house into the neighbor's house. Now, the neighbor was actually a prominent Nazi. So he actually, his first instinct would probably be not to welcome them in. But his wife was a lady of the old school, and she welcomed them in, and she even made the beds for them, she said. And they said, and they were able to stay in the neighbor's house for as long as they needed to. So they were sheltered there. Of course, all their property was looted from their house, but the Nazi actually made the looters put everything back in the house. So he turned out to be quite a great gentleman in the end, a gentleman of honor. Carmen Chacham has something to add here. Yeah, Carmen, would you like to say something?
Now.
Hello, Carmen, are you there?
Yes, hi Carmen.
Carmen?
You need to unmute yourself.
Can you unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Perfectly,
yes.
lovely.
Hi. Yes, I was just going to say that in the case of, as my mother tells the story, in their case, they were protected by friends of the family who were what we call Arabs, as in they came from the provinces. They were armed, they stood outside the house with guns and would have killed. So not all of them were that bad.
No, I think we need to pay tribute to those Muslims who protected Jews, and there were some who did.
For sure.
Yeah, but it just shows how, you know, the Jews could not rely on the forces of law and order, because some of the police joined the rioters. So, you know, it was a complete breakdown of law and order, wasn't it? And the Jews were at the mercy of you know, of good neighbors or bad neighbors. I mean, they were really in the hands of the neighbors, and if they were lucky, those neighbors would protect them.
Yes, I think in their case, the whole street were Jews lived in the whole of the street. So not only did they have their people outside their houses, but there were people standing at the entrance and at the bottom of the road to make sure that no baddies entered the street to hurt the Jews.
Right.
There was certainly, there were very decent people and there were very bad people, which is the case everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great.
Caroline and Roy Hayim.
Yeah. Caroline and Roy Hayim.
Just a statement. Listening to the stories earlier about anti-British feeling and anti-Semitism, my question was that if the British were so anti-Semitic, how come so many came to the UK, and thousands settled in India under British protection? If you read Churchill's history, he was certainly not anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish.
No, Churchill was not. Yeah,
a lot of support in the establishment of Israel.
Yeah, no, I agree. Absolutely.
It was anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I think I'm referring to people like Cornwallis, who really viewed the Jews as dispensable, you know, useful but dispensable, you know. And no, I think we need to, you know, we're very grateful to the British, because after all, the British gave us refuge, they gave us citizenship, and for that we will always be eternally grateful. But I think even in the colonial period, there was a sort of class structure, you know, that the Jews were not always allowed into British clubs and that sort of thing. There was a sort of a kind of segregation, if you
It was
like.
interesting. When
Yeah.
we went down to Kew to look at the consular documents, Cornwallis had destroyed half the documents from the beginning of June 1941 on the file that says documents were destroyed.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing about him was that the military people got the previous ambassador to be retired on the grounds of ill health, although he wasn't ill, so Cornwallis could come back to Baghdad. It's actually
Right.
quite interesting.
Yeah, that's right. We actually saw the documents complaining about the previous ambassador, and that's why Cornwallis was recalled to Baghdad. Anyway, Robert Meir, you're on.
Thank you. My mother, Georgette Lowy, whose father was Khuduri Lowy, and Khuduri and his brother Ezra Lowy lived in a house that was known as Beit Lowy. She told me this little tale long before I ever knew about or heard of the Farhud, but she said one day there were riots and the local sheikh put two of his sons outside their door to prevent anyone from coming and bothering them. And I've never been able to corroborate this. And I don't know if anyone out there may have heard something or might know about that.
Right.
I guess not.
I mean, there are, yeah, go on.
I have pictures of Ezra.
Harold, how are you?
2003.
Yeah, Harold Road, go ahead.
No, I have pictures from 2003 from Ezra Lowy's house. I think I might have even been in the house. I don't remember, but I'm happy to share them with whoever just spoke. You said it's your family.
Robert Meir, his name is. Yeah, I can put you in touch with Robert.
Fine. And I'll find the pictures. So.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Because people knew whose house it was and everything like that. It was a very nice house from the outside that I can remember. Again, I don't remember. It's 17 years already whether I was inside.
Right. This wasn't the French embassy as is today? No, because that was.
I don't think so, but I could be. Again, it wasn't then when I was there.
Yes,
that's for sure.
it is currently the French embassy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But it wasn't in 2003.
Right.
Someone would have said something, or I would have remembered. So, right. Can I just make one comment?
Sure.
On something I just wrote here. I was, from those who've heard me in other whatever places, I was very, very close with Ahmed Chalabi, who was really the one who's responsible for us having the archives. Anyway, I knew him for about 12 years, and this is before we went into Iraq. We were very, very close friends. And I was at a conference in London, and I was in an Iraqi opposition conference, and there were a few Jews there, Iraqi Jews, and so they got to me, I got to them. I don't remember how that happened. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I asked somehow the Farhud came up, and I asked, is there anybody alive who went through it? And they said that there was an older man who was about 90 at the time. That would have been in 2002. And I got his name listed somewhere, but it escapes me. I said, I'd love to go and talk to him. And they called him, I went. And then he told me a story about how the Chalabi family, they escaped to the house, the Chalabi house, who then took them to one of their huge farms, and where they stayed during all of this, of the Farhud. And after having heard that, I came back to the conference. I went to Ahmed, again, who I'd known extremely well for 12 years. And I said, Ahmed, I was just listening to stories about your family saving Jews during the Farhud. How come you never told me before? And he smiled and he said, what good would it have done? It would have sounded self-serving. Why should I do that? I'm glad you found out from somebody else. And then he told the following story. And it really He said, look, he wasn't alive then. He was born in 44. He said, but he said, my parents talked about this. And they said that the people that we had, they wouldn't eat any of our food. The only thing they would eat were boiled eggs. So, and, you know, and certainly Ahmed wasn't kosher. So and then, I mean, these are the sorts of things. They were obviously good people. But I can tell you that our nature as Jews to try to find good people. And there's no doubt that they exist, but I must tell you that unfortunately from oh my God, I'm 70 and I've been running around the Arab world since I'm about 18. Unfortunately, they're few and far between. And most of them have a herd mentality because Arab culture is really based on Bedouin culture. Someone mentioned before that Arabs came and protected their house during the thing. And the word Arab in Arabic meant, really, it meant Bedouin. Mm-hmm. And that is the basis of Islamic culture. And all the business of honor, it's very sad, but it is the way it is. Unfortunately, as I say, sadly, few and far between. And you know, we want desperately, because this is who we are as Jews, to find good people. And I'll just give you one other. A family who was if anybody knows the family named Dagestani, he was the chief of staff of the Iraqi military. Well, his daughter was a wonderful friend, and believe me, she did beautiful, beautiful things to help Jews. And she was at one time sick. She lives in Jordan. And they brought her to Israel. I forget, it was somewhere outside of Tel Aviv. And they did beautiful things. They saved her. And I remember, you know, and she's like a sister, an older sister to me. And she loves me. I love her. And I asked her, what did being in Israel mean to you? And remember, she's not anti. And I got sort of a non-answer. And it's like, I wish it were otherwise, because I love this woman. But that's the story. And maybe, look, I've probably taken too much time talking already. So
no, it's always worth listening to you, Harold. Harold Rode.
Thank you, still.
The Iraqi Jewish Archive.
Ariel.
Yeah. Okay, Ariel.
Yes, good evening, thank you. Perhaps 15 years ago in the street, I met an old woman and she was getting out from the Kupat Cholim, you know, where's Dr. Arth, and she wants some help to go to the bus station. So I tell her that I can bring her to her home. And in the car, when I bring her to the home, I say to her that I am from Morocco and from where she was. And she says she's from Baghdad. So I like history, you know, and I asked her in the same moment where you were during the Farhud. And she says that her father, who was a lawyer, yeah, and Orech Din, yes, and
yes.
Yes, and during the Farhud, they were living in a 2-apartment house. And when the Arabs came and they knocked to the door, they want to go inside. And the father take a lot of money and some gold, give this to the other family was there, that the man also was an advocate, yes? And
lawyer.
Yeah, the lawyer, and he tell him, tell them that there are no Jews in this house, and he gave them the money, and they continue. So by this, the name of the family is family Shemesh from Baghdad, and by this way he saved his family on the same day.
Oh,
thank God.
Fantastic story, yeah. All those with personal stories, you know, please do have them recorded, because, you know, we need all this for future generations. We need to record what happened, you know, and there are organizations out there who exist to record stories. There are people like David Gartan making a film, you know. Please do share your stories. Or send
It's
them-
very, very important for the future.
Yeah, it's very important for the future. Or any story, send them to me at Harif, and I'll put them up on our blog, the Point of No Return blog. Very important, as you say.
Does anyone else have any stories to share? If you
yeah.
just either raise your hand or
any other stories to share? Is Sandra Dango on the call? No. Just to say that the late Salim Fatal made a TV series back in the 1960s, I think, and he interviewed 100 people who survived the Farhud. And unfortunately, this series was only made in Hebrew, and so is not readily available to non-Hebrew speakers. But actually, talking of Salim Fatal, he wrote a book called In the Alleys of Baghdad, if anyone's familiar with that book. And he tells the story of how his family, who actually were not very rich, paid as policemen to protect them during the Farhud, and they had to pay for each bullet. The policeman's got extorted money for each bullet that he fired.
David Katan has got some more to share. I just want to show people. On Sunday, I found this card on the internet which shows the British soldier in front of the Citadel.
We've got Ariel. We've got Ariel on the.
Yeah, which is quite almost like a Harold Road moment. You actually find something instantly before the tour. I don't know if you can see that.
Okay, so David, do you want to say a bit more about your father's family?
Well, just I was actually talking to my dad, and he was telling me 79 years ago he was flying through the air. They were thrown from their house to the neighbor's house, and their neighbor went down in front of the house and protected them. He threatened to shoot the mob that was wanting to harm my dad's family. Yeah. And his name is Yassin El-Khaderi, and he was a very well-known, prominent Muslim. And, you know, there are some, obviously, that did risk their lives, but
just to clarify, your father was a small baby then.
My father was not
flying through the air.
Yes,
yeah.
he was only a toddler, 2, 3, but he has 2.5. But he remembers that vividly. He remembers being thrown
from one house to another, from one roof to another.
That's right, and yeah.
But, amazing. Have you had any contact with this well-known Iraqi Muslim?
Well, he is obviously, he was of my grandfather's generation, so he is no longer alive. But right. His daughter is a well-known Iraqi. Her name is Amal, and they have this. She runs the Al Bayt Al-Iraqi, the Iraqi house in Baghdad, but that was destroyed. But this family was a well-known and is a well-known old Iraqi family, Muslim family. So, you know, he was a very good friend of my grandfather, and they were neighbors, and he protected them during the Farhud. Unfortunately, there weren't enough Iraqi Muslims that did that, but there were a few nonetheless.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. A very mixed picture, really. I think if there are no more questions, we will bring this to a close. I'd like to thank everybody for joining this meeting. Thank you very much for your comments and your questions. And just to say that we've got an ongoing series of lectures Next one is next week. There's one on Iran, and there's one we're doing with Jemena, with Stan Ehrman. But you can get all that information on the Harif website, and Lawrence will put them up on the screen in a minute. And just to say, do subscribe to our website if you haven't already. And thank you very much for joining us, and stay safe and stay well, and see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks a lot.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Robert Muir wants to be put in touch with Harold Road. Okay, still recording.
Already